of Literature Part 2 with Mr. Taylor. Make sure you check out the first part also because it's got some good information, but it's kind of a long video, so I went ahead and I divided this one into two different parts. Where we left off in the last video, we were talking about themes, so we will move on from there. Next, I want to talk about plotline. All stories have 5 plotline points. Now, sometimes in one story, you'll have a really short falling action and resolution. Sometimes in another story, those will be a lot longer, but you're always going to have that 5. Sometimes there might be a little bit more of a focus on some parts than in others. So here are 5 points. We'll start off with our introduction. We're going to call it the exposition. This is where we introduce the reader to the setting, the characters, and our introduction to our conflict. Usually our main conflict will get introduced here in the exposition. Sometimes if you talk about an action story, you might jump right in with our conflict from the very beginning. Sometimes with more of a romantic novel, you might have more focus on the characters and the setting before you really get into the conflict. It depends on the type of story. Sometimes it'll go one way, sometimes the other. But with that conflict, we're going to drive our way up to the rising action. This one is the largest part of a story. It can make up about 85% of the story, sometimes more, sometimes less. This is the part where conflicts are going to develop. You're always going to have more than one conflict because if you just had one, that would be pretty boring. Here, you're going to have a few more, and this is where they really start to develop. Sometimes some of your smaller conflicts can get solved here just to keep us interested, but your main conflict that you have, that one is going to drive us up to our climax. This is a smaller one. This is the turning point for the main conflict. Sometimes at this point you'll know how that main conflict is going to be solved. Sometimes right here, this is where that conflict actually gets solved. So this is also going to be the most exciting, and an author can do things like use really short sentences and use really vivid verbs to really let you know that this is the most exciting part. Usually this is the part where we don't want to stop reading. We're going to keep turning those pages, or if we're watching a movie, we are really hooked in and we will be upset if someone comes to interrupt us. We'll have our main conflict if we're talking about like Cinderella. She gets her glass slipper and it actually fits on her foot. That will be the climax for this one, because that's when our conflict that she is oppressed and she's trapped and she wants to get away to another life, it doesn't actually get solved there, but we can tell how it's going to be solved. We can tell at that point when that slipper fits her foot that everything is going to turn out okay with her life, and we can know that it's going to happen because the prince is going to take her out of the bad situation that she's in. But if we talk about Sleeping Beauty, her main conflict is that she's been put under a curse, and she has been cursed that she's always going to be asleep. Well, when her Prince Charming comes and kisses her to wake her up, that does solve her problem, and that would be the climax there when she gets that true love's kiss. Her problem is solved there. So sometimes it's solved, sometimes you just know how it's going to be solved, but we're going to call it the turning point for the main conflict. That'll bring us down to our falling action. This is where things start to cool down. If there's still some conflicts going on, this is where those conflicts will start to get resolved, which is going to lead us to our very end, our resolution. This is where those loose ends will be tied up, questions will be answered, and if there's a lesson for us to learn as the readers or a lesson for a main character to learn, that's where we're going to learn that, or they're going to start applying that to their lives and change who they are. At this point in the resolution, we will know what's going to happen next for the characters. If we're talking a fairy tale, we can say, oh, and they lived happily ever after. Yeah, I know it's cheesy, but we'll know what's going to happen next for these characters. That's how we know that we have our resolution. So let's take a look at the plot line, zoomed out a little bit. Rising action there takes up the largest part of the story. Climax, resolution, those are usually the smallest points as far as how much of the story they actually take up. Then we'll move on to characters. Characters are the ones who are acting out the plot. We're going to follow them. We're going to talk about 3 different things when we describe our type of character. First, we have protagonist versus antagonist versus supporting. Our protagonist is sometimes the good guy, but not always. If we think of movies like Despicable Me or Megamind or Ocean's 11, sometimes that protagonist, that main character, is actually a bad guy. So don't tell me that the protagonist is a good guy, because that's not always true. Tell me that that protagonist is the main character, because that's exactly what we're talking about. Our antagonist then is going to be the one who goes against the main character, the one who causes problems for that main character. And then everyone else, this one's going to be easy once you figure out the first 2, everyone else will be a supporting character. Then, second, we'll talk about round versus flat. A round character will be a character that we know really well. A flat character, on the other hand, will be like a cardboard cutout. They're completely flat. We really don't know much about them as a character. We don't know their hopes, their dreams, their goals, their fears, things like that, because they're flat. A round character, though, we'll know a lot more about them. And then our third thing that we're going to talk about will be static versus dynamic. A static character will stay the same from the beginning of the story to the end. So usually you can't tell if a character is static or dynamic until you get to the end of the story. A dynamic character, on the other hand, will be one that changes. It'll be someone who grows up, becomes an adult, becomes an individual, or maybe someone who has to change something about themselves or about their personality. And that person will be a dynamic character once they make that big change. Okay, then we'll move on to conflict. Conflict here is what really drives a story. Without conflict, you don't have a story because there's nothing interesting to tell. Every story's got to have conflict, and there are lots of different options for how that conflict can come up. Usually in most stories, you'll have lots of different kinds of conflict too. Our main two types, internal versus external. The only internal conflict is a person versus self conflict. That person has to make a decision. They have to learn something about themselves. They have to become a better person. It's going to be something that they battle out within themselves. Person versus person, that one's going to be the most common. That's what you think about when you think of conflict. You think of two people facing off against each other. In person versus nature, you might have someone trying to survive out in the wild where they're facing off against the elements, or maybe you have a person who's fighting against something natural, maybe an animal that they have to fight against. And then person versus society or group. This will be when that person is facing off against more than one person. It can be a small group, maybe that's keeping them down, causing them problems, or maybe they have to face off against the entire government or the entire world because they see a problem that they've got to fix in a bigger picture of the world. And then we can have supernatural, person versus supernatural. This is when someone is going to fight against something that has more power or a different kind of power that they have. So this could be like a person fighting against a ghost or a monster, something that would not occur just normally in nature. Finally, we have person versus destiny or fate. In this story, a person is going to know what their destiny is, or sometimes it'll be haunting them and they kind of get hints of what it is if they don't actually know what their story is going to end up as. And that character can either be fighting to get to that point, fighting to get to their destiny, to realize all the things that they've been living for, or that person might be trying to fight against it. Maybe they don't like where their destiny or their fate is leading them, and they're trying to fight against that for the whole story. Sometimes they're successful, and they can change your destiny or fate. Sometimes they actually end up exactly where that destiny or that fate was pulling them. Okay, and then we're going to wrap up here with irony. This one's not technically an element of literature because it's not something that every story necessarily needs to have in order to be a story like the other ones that we've talked about. But irony is something that an author can use to make their story better, make it more interesting, and drag us along. And irony in general means the opposite of what you expect. We're going to talk about three different types. First, we have verbal, then we have situational, finally, we have dramatic. In verbal irony, that means you're going to say the opposite of what you mean. If you do this in a mean way, we call that sarcasm. If you're being sarcastic, you know, someone raises their hand in class, they give an answer, and you know it's wrong, and you just want to say, oh, you're a real genius. That is verbal irony. You're saying the opposite of what you mean, and it's sarcasm because you're doing it in a mean way. If you do it in a joking way that's not mean, we call that being facetious. If you do it on accident, you don't actually mean to say the opposite of what you mean, then we call that a malapropism. All of those are just different types of verbal irony. There's lots of options there. Situational irony is what we usually think of when we think of irony. That's when the situation that you're in is the opposite of what you expected. It's the opposite of what you expect is what happens. And then finally, we have dramatic irony. That's when we know something as the reader or as the audience that the character does not know. And usually it's something that they really do need to know. They just don't know it. However, we do, and that's where we get the opposite aspect of irony. That actually is going to conclude our little video on elements of literature. Make sure you check out the first video because this one is actually part 2 in the series, and I want to make sure you get everything that you'll need in there. So, thank you for joining. Have a great day.